Hi everyone, this is Brian Hayes and welcome to episode 41 of the Music Mind podcast. Today my special guest is Fingerstyle guitar expert R.D. King. R.D. is based in Boston, USA. He's professor of music at one of America's great universities and he has a wonderful balance between classical and contemporary music. Please enjoy my conversation with R.D. King. Well, hi RD and welcome to the Music Mind podcast. Fantastic to have you here today, all the way from Boston in the USA, as my special guest for episode 41 in the series.
It's good to be with you, Brian. Excited to be here and talk a little bit about the creative inspiration behind some of my songs.
Fantastic. Now, our audience have just seen and heard a little bit of your great arrangement, solo acoustic guitar arrangement, of George Harrison's famous song, Here Comes the Sun. What attracted you to that classic, I suppose, as a vehicle to showcase your solo acoustic guitar playing?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think almost any musician since at least 1963 has had to contend with the Beatles. And I grew up listening to a lot of their records. My dad was a huge Beatles fan, so I was listening to the Beatles since as long as I can remember, literally. And that song in particular, there's just something so magical about it. I think George Harrison just had this very special quality in his guitar playing. You know, I've heard stories about this. I guess apparently George Harrison didn't think of himself as being an amazing technical player, and he always felt like he had to compensate for that by writing extra musical and special guitar parts. And I think you hear that in his playing across the entire discography of the Beatles and his solo records as well afterwards. And in that piece, I feel like he just wrote this incredibly... It's both uplifting, but there's also something rather sad about the song too. I think it just has this real depth to it. So from a musical perspective, I loved that. From a guitar playing perspective, it just has this beautiful and very memorable guitar part.
Absolutely.
And I discovered, as you can hear in that arrangement, that you could play even just in standard tuning. I'm just playing in standard tuning there, but you can play part of the melody as harmonics, and I thought it just lent itself very well to that. So there's already a pretty involved acoustic guitar part in the song, which he's playing with a flat pick, but he's sort of using this technique where you strum chords, but there's also melodic playing in there too, right? So it's not just strumming chords. There's a real melody to the guitar part as well. So it's this very complex part. As a professor of music, I've also taught that song before, and students really struggle with that guitar part, even playing it with a flat pick. In some ways, I actually think it's almost easier as a fingerstyle guitar part. Whenever I'm arranging those songs, I also like to include the vocal melody as well, right? So I'm playing partly the guitar part, partly the vocal melody, kind of trying to mix in some of the rhythms of the bass and drums as well. So it's kind of this hybrid arrangement.
And it sounds great. And of course, obviously, as George also used, you use the capo in that song, in quite a high position. I think that just instantly gives it the classic sound that just takes your mind back to the Beatles recording there. I notice I'm a guitar player too. I also play pedal steel and slide dobro, so I'm intrigued a little bit with your right-hand technique. I guess when you think of fingerstyle guitar, there's the whole lineage of classical guitar, which of course is always played just with fingernails, nails and flesh. And if we look back at, I guess, the famous early fingerstyle players, you've got Merle Travis and then Chet Atkins built on that, and I suppose Tommy Emmanuel is the modern day master in that lineage. But you actually use what I call, the pedal steel or slide dobro right hand setup, 2 metal finger picks and a thumb pick. Tell us about that, because that is a little unusual in fingerstyle guitar.
Absolutely. Well, first, it's 3 metal finger picks and a thumb pick.
Okay.
So I use them across, my index, middle, and ring finger. And just like you said, they're these little metal picks, just for those who are watching.
Yes.
They fit on the end of your finger like this, but it actually changes quite a bit about how you're sort of striking the strings, because you have this smooth metal part. Well, in terms of how I started playing, they are a little unusual nowadays because of I just think the sound of acoustic guitar has evolved over time. They were more common back in, certainly the 50s and 60s. So a lot of the guitarists that I first was introduced to fingerstyle guitar through, which would be Leo Kottke and Jorma Kukkonen from Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna. Those were 2 of the guitar players that I was listening to when I was in that formative period of time where I was about 10 to 14, which was when I was discovering fingerstyle guitar. And I really don't remember why I made the decision to start playing with them. I think I always felt like I couldn't play as hard with my fingers as I wanted to. And I think that there's of course this delicate and beautiful sound that you can get with your fingers. When I eventually studied classical guitar later on, I used nails for playing on a nylon string guitar, and we can talk about that more too.
Yes.
But when I first was getting into guitar, I found that I loved how much they could dig in. I liked hearing some of those early Leo Kottke recordings. 6 and 12 string guitars, or the Armadillo album as it's often known, was a real pathway for me to get into fingerstyle guitar. And I just loved that he was digging in so much, and he just got this really powerful sound. I think I really loved that. I was really driven towards sounds like that, both in solo fingerstyle and acoustic guitar, but also in an electric guitar. Whatever I was listening to, I was really fascinated by just the sort of full big sound that you could get with a guitar. And the guitar is really an orchestral instrument in so many ways. It's an orchestra on its own.
Yeah, you get such a beautiful warm sound. In fact, when I first saw a couple of your videos, I didn't realize that you were using metal finger picks. You get this glorious big, fat, warm sound. Now, I notice you're playing it seems to be a consistent Martin acoustic. Is that your main axe that you seem to play? Well, I think it's the one you play all the time, is it?
It pretty much is, yes. I have it sitting right here. It's a Martin HD 35.
Yeah, beautiful guitar.
I absolutely love this. It's a little banged up, as you can maybe see.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's gotten well loved, well used.
So
And
that guitar, the other thing that I think is fantastic on your videos, as I said, you've got this beautiful warm acoustic sound. I also like the fact that has that got an inbuilt pickup, or is it always just mic'd when you record?
great question. Yeah, it has a built-in LR Bags Anthem. That's what I've had in there pretty much the whole time, which I have always been really happy with that pickup system. And so it's a kind of a dual. It's got a piezo and a transducer in there, and then I'll use that in combination with this mic that I'm using.
So you've got
right
the
now.
two feeds. Yeah, it's a beautiful sound you get, and we'll talk a little bit more about equipment, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like all around the world, people are into home recording nowadays, and the acoustic guitar is notoriously difficult to get, or I've found, to get a really natural sound when you record it. But you do get a beautiful, big, warm, natural sound. I want to play another track now of yours, and James Taylor, of course, is another famous guitarist who, built a career largely playing the acoustic guitar, and beautiful songs. Fire and Rain. Let's have a look and a listen to your version of the beautiful James Taylor classic Fire and Rain. When you're looking at building an arrangement from scratch, obviously that song, I remember when I first heard it, I thought, what an amazing song. It tells such a great story, powerful lyrics, beautiful melody. What do you look for? You know, there's millions of songs you could do a cover of. Do you sort of have is it just you're organically attracted to it, or do you have almost a little mental checklist of what you're looking for before you put in the hard yards to build an arrangement?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's counterintuitive sometimes what songs work well as solo guitar arrangements. I think in the case of Fire and Rain, that guitar part, that opening guitar part, is just so iconic and recognizable that I knew that song was going to work pretty well just on that basis alone as a solo guitar piece, right? Because it already has such a great acoustic guitar part. Now, the funny thing, though, is that there's some songs that have a great acoustic guitar part where they don't really translate that well to being a solo guitar piece.
Yeah.
And Fire and Rain was a little funny because it's a great song. The melody in the verse and chorus, I wasn't totally sure how well that would translate on a solo acoustic guitar because it is a little repetitive, I think, and it works great in the song. So I'm not critiquing the melody writing, but it does. I think I was not sure that it would be all that different, say, than the opening guitar part. But I think that one's an interesting case because I think when I first was arranging it for an event or something, I don't remember when I first started arranging that song, but it was one of those where I felt like my hands felt so natural playing it that I just felt like I had this special connection to the song. I think sometimes that's really what actually, when I think of the songs that I've recorded that seem to have that people connect to the most, it often is the ones that I think I am the most connected to. It's the ones that feel the most special. So when you're arranging songs, right, I mean, I think there's a million tremendous songs out there, but as a guitar arranger, you really need to connect very deeply. I've also arranged songs where I felt like I was arranging them more because they were just popular songs or something.
Yeah.
And that I didn't really feel a particular connection to. And those can be fine, but sometimes I have to do that I play a lot of weddings, so that's where some of my repertoire comes from, is from performing for events like that.
Yep.
And so from that, I've arranged, hundreds and hundreds of songs at this point. But the ones that have really stuck out are often, the ones where I feel an extra emotional connection to the material.
Oh, I think that's a great point. I think music it can be so many different things, and there's the academic definitions of music or whatever, but to me, I think what you just said there is so important. If you don't feel it, it's almost like going through the motions. If you're not emotionally connected to the song, it's almost like it can be like a circus act where, you're going through all the finger movements, you're playing the melody and that, but I think people pick that up. Now, the capo.
Absolutely.
The capo is an interesting little beast. I mean, I've been playing guitar. I play a million instruments, but I've been playing guitar for about 55 years. And when I was a kid, the capo was taboo. It was seen as, learn how to play a B minor chord, don't use the capo and play A minor and play B. It was a real negative. It was seen as the cheat's way to play the guitar. But of course, as time progressed, some of the best players in the world regularly use the capo. Decision-making process, I suppose, A, to use a capo, and B, to select the key that you want that capo to put you in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a great point that you bring up. And so the capo, right, which are these sorts of bars and that you clamp onto the guitar to change the register of all of the strings, right? So it's changing the entire tuning of the guitar, shifting it up depending on which fret you put it on, from either just one step up or, all the way to 7, 8, 9, 10 steps up, even in some cases. But when changing the tuning, you're also changing the register, right? And that's really a huge part of it. So I mean, Here Comes the Sun is a great example where if you play that guitar part with no capo on, for example, right, it's normally capoed on the 7th fret. If you play it in just standard tuning with no capo, it doesn't sound anything like the song.
Correct.
Even though you can hear it's still the same notes. It makes sense because you've shifted the pitch so much, right, that the register has really changed. And the way that notes really hit our eardrums, is so dependent on the frequencies themselves, right? And higher notes have higher frequencies, and lower notes have lower frequencies. That's how we define pitch as humans. But we have different associations, right, with lower sounds versus higher sounds, lower voices versus higher voices. And certainly in the case of songwriters, just changing the capo is a very easy way to keep the same guitar part, because you can literally play the same guitar part. That's the great thing about a capo, right, is that if I take a capo and put it on the second fret, I can play the same thing that I was playing when it was open, but now I can just shift all of my fingerings up 2 steps, and I get all of the same chord shapes will work, but I've changed the key, which is something, for example, on the piano, you can't do that, obviously, right? When you're playing the piano, you have to do them. Now, for that reason, just like you're saying, a lot of jazz guitarists and classical guitarists too. It's a little unusual to capo in classical music as well. It does come up sometimes, but normally in those settings, it's thought of as, if you're using that to overcome the fact that you don't know how to play in different keys, or that you can't come up with a creative solution to playing in those different keys other than just changing the capo, then that's thought of as being a little bit of a cop-out, like you were saying. But I think of it as really being just sort of, it's kind of like playing a different guitar in some ways, right? You capoing on the 7th fret. I mean, I think, I could be wrong, by the way, but I think the story I originally heard was that George Harrison had written "Here Comes the Sun" on a ukulele or something, and then which would be in line with the register there. Yeah. And so then playing it on a guitar,
that makes sense.
Sounds like a ukulele.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things like that. If you think about it sort of as just a different instrument, then it makes perfect sense. I really think about for the arrangements, I try to keep the songs in the original key for the most part. I will sometimes deviate. So there are times where it makes sense to change the original key, but normally what I'm really driven by with that is when I'm writing my original music, which I do often use a capo, but not all the time. But I would say maybe a quarter of my songs, my original songs, use a capo. And there, a capo, again, thinking about the register, it can have a profound effect on how certain chords feel. And so I'll kind of listen to certain moments in the songs and think about, okay, does this part sound too low or too high? A lot of times what I will do is, even just part of the normal process before I record a song, I will almost always try different capoing setups. Okay. So if I'm capoing on I like to capo a lot on the 2nd fret. That's probably my most common capo spot. It just adds a little bit of a little more lightness to the playing. I like to use a lot of the low strings and a lot of bass heavy parts, and so I find just capoing on the 2nd fret, it allows me to still do that, but I get a little more lightness. And also I would say that when you use a capo, you're also changing the sound of the guitar quite a bit, because the change from using the material of a capo versus just the open strings, right, where the strings are bounded by the bridge on one side and the nut on the other. Yep. That material, which is usually bone, or sometimes it's plastic now. Yeah. But that sounds very different than a capo. So even a capo on the 1st fret, where it's maybe not changing the tuning all that much, it actually changes the timbre of the open strings considerably.
Absolutely. And
it actually can sound, sometimes that makes it, I find for some songs that's much nicer. Others it's not. I'm never quite sure until I try it which way is going to work better. But for that reason, I'll often try a capo on the 1st or 2nd fret.
Let's have a listen to another beautiful arrangement you did of, well, to me, it's the Tina Turner classic, Simply the Best. Yes. But of course, it became the theme song for a Canadian TV sitcom. And I think you're basing your version more from that.
So as a wedding guitarist, I am familiar with a lot of romantic love songs from all eras, but certainly in modern times, people have picked a few special ones. And I think about it's interesting. People have always throughout history been drawn to music that's associated with romantic movies, or if you think about the history of that, I think a lot of people don't really know this anymore, but like the music for Here Comes the Bride, right? That used to be kind of the classic music. That came from an opera, right? That was from Wagner's opera Lohengrin. That was, or of course, then there was Midsummer Night's Dream. A lot of people use the recessional for would be the wedding march from Midsummer Night's Dream, which was by Mendelssohn. So these were both, stage weddings that then the people at the time, those were from the 1800s, but people listened to those and then wanted to hear those at their own weddings, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And I think similarly, in modern times, the equivalent of that is love songs from TV shows or movies. And so Simply the Best would be one of those. I can think of 1,000 Years from the movie Twilight. That would be another one that people often would request. And so I had to arrange Simply the Best for a wedding, probably 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
But I knew the Tina Turner song, but I actually had not seen the TV show, so it was an introduction to that song.
Did the guitar sort of find you, or did you find it? What's your earliest interests and evolution, I suppose, as a musician?
Well, I took piano lessons, like many people, when I was 6 or 7, I think. And I was not drawn to it. I think I had a sort of strict teacher. But I, despite that, was very interested in music. I grew up in a family of musicians. So my dad is, he's a mechanical engineer, but he was a very passionate musician, and still is. He still plays in a band and records his own songs and plays guitar, bass, and sings. And so that was the atmosphere that I grew up in. My uncle is a professor of music and went to Berkeley. And so music was just all around when I was growing up. And because of that, my dad certainly wanted me to play an instrument. And so first we tried piano a little bit when I was younger. And then when I was 10, I think he bought me my first guitar.
Okay.
And that I really was just I was not very drawn to it right away. I think I was a little bit intimidated because he was a serious musician and my uncle was as well. There were other musicians around that I just think I felt like I don't know if I'm really the kind of person who would become a musician. So I was I was very intimidated by it, and I took lessons for a few years. I was okay at it. I did not feel naturally gifted at it. It was not something like, the first time someone put a guitar in my hands, I felt drawn to it. Not really. It wasn't until a few years down the road when I was maybe 13 or so that I started hearing more of this fingerstyle music. And when I started really listening to music in a more intentional way, and because I'd played a little bit of guitar at that point, I think when you haven't even played guitar, you don't even necessarily know what's really happening when you're listening to guitar in general, right? But having taken some lessons, when I was hearing fingerstyle guitar, I knew enough to know that something different was happening.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is happening here? This sounds like multiple guitars, but I think there's only one guitarist in this. Right? What's going on? I thought it was so interesting that they could play multiple guitar parts at once, and I was just absolutely fascinated by that. And that included, like I mentioned before, Jorma Kekkonen from Jefferson Airplane and Hot Tuna, and he played a lot of acoustic fingerstyle blues and used fingerstyle. He used finger picks while playing a lot of fingerstyle acoustic blues. And there was Leo Kottke, who would write these instrumental songs that were kind of all over the map. They had included folk and country and a little bit of blues in there as well, right? But certainly was a great songwriter, and I mean, still is. And then I eventually got into Lindsey Buckingham from Fleetwood Mac, who just writes these very beautiful and complex fingerstyle guitar parts as part of his songs. He would sing over them, of course. And so all of those, I thought that was the coolest sound. So I got very into that idea, and I remember talking to my uncle, who I would see, he lives around Boston as well, where I grew up, and I remember talking to him about it at one point, and he's primarily an electric guitarist, but can play kind of all styles. And so he introduced me a little bit to fingerstyle guitar, and he showed me Bach's Bourrée in E minor, which is kind of a very famous fingerstyle piece. And he was like, well, if you want to, I was like, well, yeah, I want to be able to play that right now. But that was a little too complicated. So he would set out these little challenges for me. So the first one he gave me was to try to play a simple melody like Ode to Joy, and put a bass line underneath it. And now that I teach fingerstyle guitar and have been classically trained and so forth, I can see now that's actually already quite a challenge. That's not a first level challenge, really, but there was something about it I just was so fascinated by. I remember doing nothing but practicing that for a couple weeks until I could do it. I think there was something about fingerstyle in particular that just suited the way that my brain works. I loved the puzzle of it, of figuring out how to coordinate the melody and the bass line at the same time, and eventually adding in inner voices, having to move the left and right hands in this very synchronized dance. I just thought I just found it so fulfilling and satisfying to get down, and then the sound is so beautiful and complex, and it had this richness. And so once I found that, I didn't want to stop. Once I found that, I dove into guitar, and I became fairly obsessed for the next few years with playing fingerstyle guitar, and slowly progressing to more and more advanced pieces in that arena, until eventually I studied classical guitar. I applied to school for classical guitar on a whim because I really wasn't sure if I could get in. I was mostly self-taught. I did go back to taking some lessons in high school with a great guitarist, but he was not primarily a fingerstyle guitarist, so he was mostly just teaching me theory and things like that. So I really didn't know if I could even get in for fingerstyle guitar. So I applied for classical training. I had to borrow a classical guitar from my uncle. And I had mostly applied to other schools for university that were non-music related. So I was not thinking necessarily that I would be a musician.
Yeah.
But I went to Ithaca College. They they saw some potential in me, I guess, even though I could barely read music. And so then I studied classical guitar performance there, and I was still not sure even when I started there that I was really up for studying classical music. I didn't know classical music very well at all, but I fell in love with it. I loved the sort of academic analyzing part of classical music and the complexity of the harmony and understanding all the ways the different pieces of music fit together, and the sort of more thoughtful approach to what is sometimes called art music, which is really just differentiating classical and jazz from pop music, for example.
Yeah.
Where the aim of it is not necessarily to be catchy and popular, but is to tell this sort of deeper part of the human experience. And obviously some pop music does that as well. The best.
So this is a really interesting direction here, because the fundamental difference between classical, I suppose, and creative music, if we want to call it, even though if you go back in history, I guess the great composers were the jazzers of their era long before that term even existed. But there is this concept of improvisation. In classical music, there's an expectation, don't muck around with Bach's melody, like to play it as it was originally done. In jazz, of course, the people are really interested in waiting to get to hear what you're going to do in your solo. I mean, anyone can play Things Ain't What They Used to Be, but people are paying to hear what's going to happen after you ba-ba-da, 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 ba and do ba. That's what they're paying the money for, is what's this guy or gal going to do? Now, I suppose it's a question I wanted to ask you. Your arrangements, and you've probably half answered it, seem very rehearsed. You don't play them in a strict, laborious way, but how much freedom, how much license do you give yourself to, on the spot, get off the beaten track? Is there any license when you're playing Simply the Best? You've no doubt played that 1,000 times and it's in your DNA. Do you ever give yourself the license, say, I'm going to experiment a bit on the fly, walk the plank and improvise a little bit? Tell me about that.
It's a great question. I think there's I'll answer the philosophical part of that question and then the practical ramifications of it.
Yes.
I was very drawn. I love both of those worlds. So I love the classical regimented, this is exactly how to play it. I like the precision and the attention to detail that classical music often has that other styles of music don't necessarily have, where we're going to not just play every note as it's written, but we're going to really rehearse the exact way we play every note. So we're going to have this swell in the music and we're going to shape, that's often what they call it, right? Shaping the melody and the phrasing. That of course takes place in pop music too, but in classical music, you really agonize over that. And when I would prepare recitals of classical music, you really think about how you want to shape each phrase and each movement and so forth. And I loved that. I will say that I think classical music now is very different from classical music several hundred years ago. Certainly in, Beethoven and Bach's time, for example, Bach, who's now thought of as the greatest classical composer of all time, in his lifetime, actually, people didn't particularly think of him as a great composer, but they did think of him as an incredible improviser. He was known as the best improviser of his day.
Yes.
And he could improvise fugues, which is an incredibly complex style of counterpoint.
Yeah.
And so he was kind of a special improviser. Certainly Beethoven and Mozart, people like that, were unbelievable improvisers. And in their day, in concerts too, they were not the stuffy, silent classical music concerts as they are now. In their day, they would be performing, if Beethoven was performing, for example, people would often shout out themes of Mozart's. Like they would say, "Oh, the theme from the Magic Flute," or Don Giovanni.
Okay.
And then Beethoven would just improvise on it and come up with a theme and variations, making up his own versions of the melody and everything on the spot. So that was that used to be more the part of classical music. It wasn't until later on that it became this very, prim and proper thing. That was more of a later thing, and that's kind of when the split happened too. Was from classical music didn't used to be called classical music; it was just music, and then eventually there became this split, right, where it sort of branched off and became a little bit more this kind of nostalgic graveyard for music that's hundreds of years old, which I love, but is still, I think, a problem that classical music has never quite managed to solve since then. But so I have both of those. I did love the very prim and proper part of classical music, but I also grew up listening to a lot of rock and jazz, and I loved soloing. I loved improvising in that way, the magic of the moment. And I had a lot of experience growing up playing with other musicians and improvising and coming up with music on the spot. And oftentimes I had this one friend who's an incredible guitarist who I grew up with, where we would just sit and play sometimes for hours. We wouldn't even say anything to each other. We would just sit and make up music and just, I think hopefully a lot of musicians out there can relate to that feeling of just being lost in the music and you're not even thinking about what comes next. So I had both of those in my background. So I was a little bit unusual as a classical guitarist. And I'm a little unusual as a non-classical guitarist. I'm kind of halfway caught between those two worlds. So when it comes to my own arrangements and my own songs too, I usually have a pretty good idea of what I want to play, but I do allow myself quite a bit of license in the exact way that I play it. So if I was to play Here Comes the Sun or Fire and Rain right now, they would certainly sound pretty similar to what you've heard, but the notes would be in a slightly different order, the textures, the rhythms. I will improvise quite a bit when it comes to those. So like Fire and Rain, for example, if you listen to that, all of those verses I've done a little bit differently.
Yes.
And they're similar, but I did not script out beforehand in what ways really I was going to change them particularly. Maybe I might have a couple spots where I was really thinking about how I wanted to exactly do it. But for the most part, I'm kind of making it up as I go in that way.
I just want to talk a little bit now about your involvement in music education. We've learned a little bit about you. You sort of started out self-taught. You had family members who were great musicians. I assume all of those early years, that was all on acoustic guitar, or did you ever venture into electric guitar?
I did have an electric guitar. I had a Les Paul Epiphone.
Okay.
And I would play that quite a bit in high school, but there's no question I spent the vast majority of my time on a steel string guitar.
Yeah. So nowadays you're a professor of music. You obviously don't wear that hat just by playing the blues pretty good at the jazz club. So tell us a bit more about your education, how you got to that position, and I suppose also I notice on your website you offer a range of tuition services, including one-on-one online teaching. Talk a bit about your current day involvement in music education. Tell us a bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So I am a professor of music at UMass Boston. I'm an associate lecturer there, and I teach private guitar courses there for music majors and non-majors. And I've done that for 4 or 5 years, I guess I've been there. But I've run my own private teaching practice for over a decade now. And I've taught many hundreds of students through that of all skill levels. And before that, I also taught through an organization, a teaching school in Massachusetts here as well. So yeah, I've taught. My teaching experience grew over time. When I was first starting out as a musician, I did not harbor any ambitions to become a music educator, but it's something that a lot of musicians fall into over time because there's a natural demand for it, and artists, a huge part of artists' careers often ends up being education and sharing music. And I think that also becomes a way, as it has been for me, for artists to hone their own artistic philosophies and opinions. And I find that all the aspects of my daily, monthly, and annual life, which include a lot of teaching and education, and then also a lot of performing, and then also a lot of writing and recording, all of those to me feed into each other, right? Where being an active performer and someone who writes my own music gives me this a greater depth in my ability to be an educator, right? But also spending so much of my time every day talking about music, how to make meaningful music, that also feeds into me becoming a better performer and composer as well, because I'm spending all day being like, oh yeah, this is actually really important when you're making music. And then, I need to be reminded of that too. It's not like you ever get tired of hearing those reminders yourself, right? So I find that they all feed into each other.
I think we all learn so much when we've got to explain something that we know ourselves we can inherently do. I teach guitar and I'll see someone struggling with a D chord, and in my mind I'm thinking, come on mate, it's not that hard, it's a D chord. But of course the thing is, we'll try and play a D chord with you, swap the guitar around the other way around and see how clever you are playing a D chord when it's completely new to you, Right. So I think there's that humility in being a teacher as well, and it's the noble thing to do. Doc Severinsen, the fantastic trumpet player, he's still alive, he's 98 and still belting away on the trumpet at home in his slippers, I'm sure, of a night. But he did a wonderful quote in an interview. He said, look, if you get good at something, get really good at it, you must pass it on. You have to pass. He saw it as an obligation. If you've got a skill developed to a high level, don't die with that skill. Pass it on,
Well, I love that. And I think a core part of being a musician or an artist of any kind is building a community, connection with other people. And I think that that's a foundational part of what art is. Art is communication, right? It's could be ideas, emotions, thoughts, experiences, and transmuting that into this external thing that other people are then going to receive and take something away from. They may not be exactly what you intended, but to my mind, I'm paraphrasing Camus here. I read his Creating Dangerously essay last year, and I just absolutely loved it. But it was something to the effect of the goal of all artists must be global communication, which he was sort of meant that this idea that people talk about with music of it being a universal language.
Yeah.
And he was sort of applying that to art in general, that's sort of like the highest goal that art can attain to. Wonderful. And to my mind, teaching is really a key part of that too. It's the same thing that you're talking about. It is to pass on not just the nuts and bolts of how to play a D chord, which, to my mind, a lot of that stuff, that's a lot of times I think as a guitar teacher, it can become just a sort of like a personal trainer at the gym or something, but it's just for guitar. That's right. And that part's fine. Yes. But I find the more interesting part is when we get to talk about how to play expressively, what it means to play with feeling. Emotion. How do you, that's the special part.
Totally agree. Now, one thing you do is you're a wonderful interpreter of music, and I suppose classical music, that's it. Your job is interpret the masters. But you also interpret the pop tunes wonderfully well. But the third string in your bow is you're also a composer of original music. Now, I want to play, you've got a great video clip for a tune you composed called Darker Days. Let's have a look at that first, and then we'll come back and talk about your process of creating your own music, where you start with a blank slate. You haven't got a famous melody to build an arrangement on. Let's have a look and listen to Darker Days. Buddy, that's a beautiful song. What's your approach to composing your own music where you're just starting, you haven't got anything to build on? Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think of composing or songwriting, whatever you want to call it, that was to me the most interesting and intriguing part of playing music. And I felt drawn to that even when I knew only 3 chords on the guitar. I was already interested in how can you assemble these to make songs. And I was always more interested in that, even when I was discovering the fingerstyle greats and learning more about some of my guitar heroes growing up. I still was more interested in writing my own songs. And I remember, a lot of conversations where people would ask me when I was, 15 or 16, oh, wow, you can play that guitar pretty well. What songs do you know? And I would think, oh, I don't really know any songs. I mostly just learned my own songs. I write my own stuff. And that was always most interesting to me. And when I think about, how I approach that, a lot of times it begins with a flash of inspiration, or really just an impulse, I think, to create that. I think my writing, and I think this is true for a lot of people, is at its best when it is not forced. And there's something very difficult about this, right? This is the tricky thing about being a creative person and trying to be an artist, is that you have to balance the spontaneity of it with also the need to create something, right? So when I would potentially want to record an album, right, it's like, okay, well, now I need to get 10 songs together to do that, right? And that's a funny bit of pressure. So I've kind of done it both ways. I've had times where I just let the music come up organically, and then I have other times where I try to practice being able to create kind of on the spot.
Do you try and create some new music every day, every week, or just when you feel like it? How often are you in that situation of saying, look, I need to write something?
Yeah, I try to at least have a backdrop of every week. So I have a series that I run on Instagram and YouTube called 1 Minute Wednesday, where I write a brand new minute-long song.
Great.
And yeah, I found that practice to be invaluable. So it's just once a week. I don't have to do it every single day. And I do put a fair bit of time into it. So you might think, oh, just a 1 minute guitar piece, you could pretty much just improvise that. And I could, but I purposefully am trying to actually compose something here. So I do try to make it an actual written piece. There might be some improvisatory elements to it, but it does need to feel like a composition.
A piece. Yeah.
Yeah. And I find having a weekly sort of accountability deadline for that really helps with getting into the creative zone. Now, sometimes it backfires, and there's certainly lots of weeks where I don't feel like doing it. And I've gone through periods depending on if I'm working on an album or something, I will put it to the side for a little bit. Sometimes if I have some other more major work that I'm working on. So certainly when I've done any of the 6 albums of original music, then I've usually had to put it to the side for a little bit. But I do find that having this kind of weekly, okay, I'm going to have an outlet of some music. It also means that it's also very freeing, because when I'm writing something for an album, and maybe you can relate to this, when you're trying to really publish something, I guess I'll call it, in this more official way, then you really feel like it has to be this certain thing. It really needs to not just be at a certain very, very high standard, right? It needs to be the very best you can do, but it also needs to really match sort of your vision of yourself as an artist, right? It's like I kind of feel all the albums I sort of feel like are artistic statements on my, certain perspective and philosophy on music. When I'm just writing a single minute-long song, I don't feel that pressure as much. It doesn't have to be the best thing I've ever written. It doesn't have to match the styles that I normally write in. So I just wrote a very a bluesy acoustic one for the last Wednesday. I just wrote one for last Wednesday that was very simple and but very fast, kind of is the kind of bluesy show-off thing that is really not in the style that I write in. for my albums at all. It's the opposite of Darker Days. But I found it's just very freeing because I can just write it and it's great practice. And now I get some practice at writing this sort of more virtuosic bluesy thing that then I can maybe take some aspect of that and bring it into the more long form pieces that I'll write, but I can just also write it and let it go. And
what are you recording into? What software? What's your DAW?
I use Reaper, which is a very unknown one for the most part, but it's a very simple, sort of stripped down one, and I find it very useful because of that for doing a lot of the simple projects that I have, which are just guitar. And so I kind of like it because it doesn't actually have all the bells and whistles of some of the other DAWs, which I have used over the years. But it's a very simple process. And then I have a few different reverb plugins. I have a Strymon Big Sky pedal, which I use sometimes. And I also have a OC5 octave pedal.
Okay.
And that's by a Boss. And those are the two that I use the most. I also use a Valhalla Shimmer plugin. That's the reverb that people are usually commenting on, and that's a pretty famous just digital reverb. But it's a beautiful shimmer reverb. It adds this very sort of celestial sound to the guitar, and I love that. I grew up listening to a lot of Pink Floyd. Was one of my favorite bands, and I loved hearing David Gilmour's reverb drenched solos. So yeah.
Well, look, what I hear in your playing, there's effects there, obviously, but they naturally enhance the sound of your guitar. It doesn't sound like a beautiful guitar sound being spoiled by the effects. I want to come now into, it's one thing in your own studio getting the sound you want. You're in total control over the sound you want. But you play at a lot of weddings out in the park.
Yes.
Under the tree,
Sure.
And I assume you 9 times out of 10 you would have to bring some form of amplification with you.
Yes. So when I'm performing for weddings, I will usually be using a Fishman SA330X, which is a great amplification system designed specifically for acoustic guitar by the company Fishman. They do a lot of other acoustic amplifications. They have preamps and pedals also. They have all sorts of products, and they're actually based here in Massachusetts too, which is neat. So, but they're a great company, and that product, I've loved that amplifier for almost, I guess, over 10 years now, actually. And it's been a great companion for all of the weddings, and it produces a beautiful acoustic guitar sound. So that's
fantastic.
How I render it live.
Now, one of the questions, I suppose, that I have to ask is, as an acoustic guitarist, I'm most frequently, if someone runs into me and that I haven't met before, Brian, can you sing us a song? Damn it, I've spent 55 years working out how to play the guitar. I can barely sing for nuts. But there's an enormous public pressure if you're seen there sitting with a guitar. The great Tommy Emmanuel sings a few blues songs in his sets. Yep. Largely, I think, driven by a little bit of pressure to do it. I mean, one of the most tragic things I've heard in this very studio is a local guitarist. I'll say, have you ever heard of Tommy Emmanuel? Oh, he can't be much of a guitarist. He doesn't sing. He can't be much of a guitar player because he doesn't sing. Now, I just, I have to draw a line there, and we have a pretty deep discussion about the difference between playing guitar and singing. But you're a wedding performer. Yeah. Are you ever under pressure to sing My Heart Will Go On or something, or do you just make it dead set clear that you are an instrumentalist?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have made it dead set clear that I'm an instrumentalist, and so I don't field any requests for singing. I love vocals, and I sing on my own time. I'll sing personally, but not. I'm a mediocre to barely passable singer.
Me too.
And I've I won an international competition on the guitar. I'm not going to win an international competition for my singing, that's for sure. So I don't think adding my mediocre to bad and untrained vocals to the song is not really going to add much, I don't think. I mean, I've considered it over the time, not because of public pressure, but just from an artistic standpoint, as a composer and songwriter, I certainly have written things where I could imagine a vocalist singing. But no, I mean, I think there's there's certainly a long history of guitarists also who aren't singers who are pretty good at guitar. So I think certainly there's lots of them too where they do sing because they feel like they have to. I mean, I think of guitarists like Eric Clapton or I mean even Jimi Hendrix or something too, right? Not he's an okay singer, but certainly certainly not an incredible singer. So I
guess it's the environment too. Weddings all about the message, the story. Aren't we in love?
Sure.
And they're if you go to a Django Reinhardt concert at the the Hot Club in Paris, you're not expecting Django to start singing Stardust, but in a wedding, I can just imagine there must have been times. Have you ever had to collaborate in a wedding environment with an actual singer? Have you ever felt that you've had to go as a duo or not?
I have, yeah. I have done I've done collaborations before at weddings.
Yes,
and they work really well. But yeah, it's usually I only do that really under special circumstances. So it's already, weddings are already fairly high stress to prepare for.
Absolutely,
and so really what I do with I play about 50 to 60 performances a year, about 20 to 25 of those are weddings, and the rest are other events. And for all of those, the way that I, as a working musician, manage to keep my life to a workable level of work is to really only take performances that I feel are adding something to my life. So for weddings, I love playing weddings because it's a beautiful day that everyone's very happy to be there for.
Yes.
And being able to set the tone for it is really special. I'm playing the ceremony and cocktail hour normally, so it's more it's a spot where instrumental music actually works really, really well, because for the ceremony it obviously just sort of sets the tone and it creates this kind of cinematic feeling, right? And and the cocktail hour similarly, even though people are a little more energetic, but during the cocktail hour no one wants to listen to someone singing, really. I mean, obviously there's exceptions to this. Sometimes it can be great, but that's generally what I think. So I feel like it actually works really, really well for that. Every now and then, certainly I've had people reach out to me asking if I would, we're really looking for a singer for the cocktail hour, would you do it? And my answer is no. No. I will not. I do what I do, and I do it very well, and there's demand for it, so I don't really have any reason to do anything else.
And I think that's good that you make it clear up front. If you accept the job, they are booking you as an instrumentalist. I think that's a great way to go. Harvest Moon, a great song by Neil Young. You've mentioned your guitar influences. I mean, one of the best things I think any instrumentalist can do is listen to some great vocalists and their phrasing, their breathing, the space. Do you have any influences from the past that were not instrumentalists? Who were some of or were you largely listening to instrumentalists?
It's a great question. I'll have to think about that for a second. Well, I certainly encourage my students generally to listen to all types of instruments, including voice.
Yes.
Right. So not just listening only to guitarists, and to also specifically transcribe vocal parts in particular for the guitar. So that's a very common jazz challenge, right? Is to take a vocal melody and try to render it on the guitar, and not just finding the main pitches, but also finding all the little slides and scoops and bends, all of those little subtleties in the articulation. So from that standpoint, absolutely. I used to listen to a lot of jazz vocalists, certainly the classics. A jazz guitarist friend of mine recommended that I transcribe the melodies for Ella and Louie, which is a very famous album.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And do I have that right? Is it Ella, Louie, or Louie and Ella?
Whichever one it is. The two of them. It's a wonderful album. Yeah.
It's a great album.
Yeah.
And so I used to do things, exercises like that quite a lot. I would say, Neil Young was definitely an influence of mine from that perspective. He also happened to be a favorite of one of my first guitar teachers, who taught me Heart of Gold, Old Man.
Yeah.
Actually, the song Harvest, which is actually different than Harvest Moon, right?
Yes. Yes.
But a lot of those tracks were some of the very first songs I ever learned on the guitar.
Just before we listen to Harvest Moon, you touched on some really good things. The most recent guest I've had on, which will come just before your episode, is a wonderful young jazz trumpet player from New York, Kellen Hannis. She's only 24. And she won a national jazz trumpet competition, I think, when she was 19. And she played Sleepy Time Down South. And the judge at the end said, "That's fantastic, Kellen. I loved your choice of songs." She said, "Have you ever heard the words to that song?" And Kellen's she heard Wynton Marsalis's instrumental version. Louis Armstrong had recorded that song 100 different times. 100 different recorded versions. It became his theme song. And Kellen openly says, wow, she learned a lesson that day, because the judge knew she'd never heard that song. She'd never heard the words of that song. And the judge's message was, look, you played it beautifully, but, if you're going to play a famous song that's been recorded more than 100 times, don't be the only one in the world who's never actually heard what the song's about. Let's have a listen to Harvest Moon, because you absolutely get the point of this song in your beautiful solo rendition. RD, we've heard you play some wonderful music today, and there's a lot of wisdom in the comments you've made. I guess in today's world, we're recording this in 2026. One of the real challenges for musicians is monetizing their music. We can all play for nothing. There's always somewhere to play music if you're prepared to play for nothing. But can you talk a little bit about, and you have obviously developed some separate income streams. How do you piece together making a life in music? Just talk a little bit about that, the way you are currently making a professional career in music.
Sure. Well, I can talk about the specifics in my case, and then maybe some more useful, I think, philosophical perspectives to take when approaching a creative career.
Yeah.
In my specific case, I split things between performing and teaching, and it's interesting because a lot of people find my original music or my arrangements on social media or Spotify, all that. But I really don't make very much money from that personally. I'm sure there are musicians out there who do, but for me, hasn't been the case. But what those have sort of always ended up serving as is an attractive advertisement for my playing, which has led to demand for lessons and for performances. So it's very interesting the way it works. I think certainly in the case of Spotify or Apple Music, right, or YouTube, Instagram, all of these things. I mean, I recently had a Instagram video for going to California that got 450,000 views. I didn't make any money from that. That's just kind of the way that it goes. I think when approaching a creative career, you really have to have an entrepreneurial spirit, and these are the sorts of things that when I was young, people certainly told me, but I kind of naturally felt it. But I think they bear repetition and being repeatedly reminded of, especially if you're just starting out in your career. I think one, just taking a tremendous amount of initiative. No one's going to show up and give you a career in music, that's for sure. Two would be making sure that you're really thinking about where you'd like to be, making money from, if it's teaching and so forth. And I think another thing that I think about a lot is really when I'm counseling students, either at the university or just privately, is sort of what your real goals are in your life. I think a lot of times people that are very creative feel like they should be making all their money from music or something. And I guess my perspective on that is that that's not always the best thing for everyone. And I grew up with a model of my father, who was a great musician, but was also a mechanical engineer by day, and that stability of career allowed him to be creative in a very joyful way. And he was able to he kept a band going for the last several decades, has been able to record and perform really as much as he wants to, essentially, and has made it a very significant and meaningful part of a full life. And I think sometimes people will get a little caught up on being sort of black and white about a life in the arts and being like, I need to make every dollar from my music or my art. And I think that sometimes that actually makes you miserable and puts a lot of pressure on the music. And I think, yes, it can work. And I, have made it work from performing and teaching. But I think that I always knew when I was starting out to do that if I couldn't make that work, that I would be happy doing something else and keeping music as always the sort of sole passion. I don't think there's any shame or anything in doing something else and keeping music as its own special thing that is free of pressure in a commercial way.
I totally agree, and a number of my past guests have said exactly the same thing. What's the best way for people to reach out and connect with you? You've got a website. Can you just tell people what that website is?
Sure. You can find me at rdkingmusic.com. And I also am very active on Instagram and YouTube. You can search for RD King Music, and it will usually be the first thing to appear. I also have my original music on Spotify, Apple Music, all of the streaming sites, and I have 6 albums of original music out, and I'm releasing plenty more in the coming months. There's always new stuff coming out, so that's where you can find me.
Fantastic. And I really encourage our viewers to reach out and connect with your music, even if it's just to look at your YouTube channel, because you do have some wonderful examples of creative solo acoustic guitar playing. You play in your own style, but you have a lovely mix of interpretations of songs that I'm sure everyone will pick up some of those songs as known to them, but they've probably never heard it played on solo fingerstyle guitar. And that's exactly what I want to go out with. I want to play your version of Etta James's classic At Last. This would be one of the last songs I think I would attempt as a solo acoustic guitar player, because it's not, it's not a 3-chord country song or a 12-bar blues. It's a pretty involved song, this one, with a beautiful melody. So just before we hear that, Artie, I just want to say thanks for taking part in this. It's been a wonderful conversation. You're a great musician, and I'm sure your career is just going to continue to bloom as you find new avenues to explore your creativity. Thanks for being part of the podcast.
Brian, thanks for having me. It was great to sit and talk with you about music and getting involved in music and teaching and the effects of art and music. And I find you've asked some very incisive questions, so I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you. Let's have a look and a listen to At Last. For the collaboration to finish this episode, RD suggested the beautiful Going to California, a song made famous by Led Zeppelin. RD's on his beautiful Martin acoustic guitar, and I'm playing my Armstrong concert flute.